The Las Vegas Martial Arts Expo was the kind of event that people saved up for months to attend. Tickets had sold out in under 3 hours. Fans had flown in from Japan, Brazil, Russia, and everywhere in between. The arena was packed wall to wall, every single seat filled, and the energy humming through the building felt less like a sports event and more like something historical was about to happen. Massive banners hung from the ceiling, showing decades of martial arts legends, but two names dominated every conversation in every corner of that building. Chuck Norris, Steven Seagal. Two men, two legends, two completely different worlds of martial arts. And by the end of the night, only one of those worlds would leave the audience completely speechless. Chuck Norris arrived backstage first, and the moment he walked through those doors, the entire room shifted. Staff members straightened up, security guards stood taller. Other martial artists, men and women who had trained their whole lives, turned to watch. Chuck had that effect on people. He walked with the kind of confidence that didn't need to announce itself. His shoulders were relaxed, his smile was wide and easy, and his eyes carried the look of a man who had been in more real fights, more real competitions, and more real dangerous moments than most people could ever imagine. He was a cowboy, a champion, a man who had won championships in Tang Soo Do, built a career in Hollywood, and earned the respect of fighters worldwide. When Chuck Norris walked into a room, everyone knew it. He greeted people warmly, shook hands, laughed loudly, and made the whole backstage feel like a celebration. That was Chuck. He brought energy wherever he went, bold, bright, and never afraid to speak his mind. Steven Seagal arrived differently. No announcements, no loud laughter, just footsteps, slow, deliberate, almost silent footsteps that somehow every single person in that corridor could feel before they heard them. Steven moved through the hallway like deep water, smooth on the surface, but absolutely impossible to disturb underneath. His dark coat, his calm expression, his unhurried pace. People stepped aside without being asked, not because they were afraid, but because something about his presence suggested very strongly that the space around him belonged to him. Where Chuck filled a room with noise and warmth, Steven filled it with something else. Weight, stillness, the quiet kind of power that made experienced fighters uncomfortable in ways they couldn't explain. Backstage, the two legends ended up in the same preparation area. Staff moved carefully between them, sensing something unspoken in the air. Steven found a corner of the room and began moving through his Aikido forms, slow, circular movements, his arms sweeping gently through the air in wide, flowing arcs, his feet shifting with tiny, precise steps. His breathing was controlled and steady, like a man meditating rather than warming up for a performance in front of thousands of people. Chuck watched him from across the room. At first, he just watched quietly, but Chuck was Chuck, and quiet was never his natural state. He leaned toward one of the nearby fighters, speaking loud enough that several people turned their heads. Is he warming up or painting a picture? A few people chuckled nervously. Chuck smiled wider, encouraged by the reaction. He looked back at Steven and mimicked one of the slow, circular arm movements, exaggerating it, making it look like someone trying to swat away an invisible butterfly. I've seen smoother moves in a slow dance class, he said, and this time the laughter from nearby fighters was harder to hide. Several cameras that had been set up backstage quietly captured the moment. Steven did not react. He continued his movements, slow circles, precise footwork, steady breathing. If he heard any of it, and everyone in that room knew he did, he gave absolutely nothing away. Not a twitch of the mouth, not a flicker in the eyes, not a pause in his movement. That stillness, that complete refusal to react,
somehow made the room feel more tense, not less. Chuck tried one more time. He stepped closer, arms wide, voice warm and joking. "Steven, come on, tell me honestly. If someone runs at you in the street full speed, are you gonna do slow circles at them?" More laughter. A couple of martial artists at the edge of the room were genuinely entertained. One or two others were staring at Steven's face, waiting for something, anything, a reaction, a word, a sign of irritation. What they got instead was worse. Steven stopped moving. He stood perfectly still. And then very slowly, he turned his head and looked directly at Chuck. Not an angry look, not a cold look, just a look. Calm, patient, absolute. The kind of look that belongs to someone who has already decided how every single version of the next few minutes ends and is completely comfortable with all of them. Two of the cameramen took an involuntary step backward. Chuck held the stare for a moment and then smiled, turning back to his side of the room. But the smile was just slightly different now, just slightly more careful. The arena announcer's voice boomed through the backstage speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our two legendary guests to the main stage." The roar from the crowd hit them through the walls like a physical force. Thousands of voices, one enormous sound. Chuck rolled his neck, bounced on his toes, and headed for the tunnel with his usual swagger. Steven simply walked forward, hands relaxed, face unreadable. The lights inside the arena were blinding. The crowd stood as one. Thousands of phones lit up. The noise was extraordinary, the kind of sound that gets into your chest and makes your heart beat faster whether you want it to or not. Giant screens on either side of the stage showed slow-motion highlights. Chuck's legendary spinning kicks from his competition days, Steven's famous wrist locks and throws from his most iconic films. The crowd screamed louder with each clip. Chuck came out first, waving both arms, working the crowd like a natural entertainer. He pointed at fans, accepted the love, and soaked in every second. His charisma was real and powerful, and 15,000 people felt it all at once. Then the spotlight shifted to the entrance tunnel. Steven Seagal stepped out. The change in the arena's energy was immediate and strange. The volume didn't go up. If anything, it shifted sideways into something else, something harder to name. 15,000 people who had been screaming a moment ago went into a kind of focused, electric hush. Eyes tracked him automatically. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People who had been filming Chuck suddenly turned their cameras. Steven walked slowly down the ramp, hands folded in front of him, sunglasses on. Each step deliberate, unhurried, and somehow louder in the silence it created than Chuck's entrance had been in all its noise. The announcer introduced them both, and the full roar returned, but underneath it, something had shifted. Everyone in that building felt it. This wasn't going to be a simple, friendly demonstration. Chuck grabbed the microphone first, which surprised no one. He grinned at the crowd, let the cheers wash over him, and then turned to Steven with the expression of a man who had been waiting to deliver a punchline. "Before we start," he said, voice warm and playful, "I want to publicly apologize to Steven." The crowd went curious. Murmurs spread. Chuck paused for comic effect. "I'm sorry for what I'm about to do to Aikido." The arena burst out laughing. It was a good joke, delivered perfectly, and Chuck knew it. He spread his arms wide and addressed the crowd like he was explaining something obvious. "Look, I have enormous respect for Steven, enormous. But Aikido? All those beautiful flowing circles? Come on. Those beautiful slow circles are gorgeous to watch. But if someone attacks you, you can't redirect them to sleep." More laughter, camera flashes everywhere. Commentators were already calling it a classic Chuck Norris moment.
Steven stood with the microphone at his side, not raising it, not speaking, just watching Chuck with that patient, unreadable expression. The crowd started to notice it. A few people pointed. Someone in the front row said loudly, "He's so calm, it's scary." Chuck gestured toward Steven, inviting him to respond. "Go ahead, Steven. Tell the people. Defend the circles." Steven raised his microphone slowly. The arena went quiet almost immediately. Something about his stillness commanded attention without demanding it. And then, in a low, even voice that somehow carried to the back of every section, he said just 5 words. "Let the technique speak instead." He lowered the microphone. The silence lasted about 1 full second. Then the crowd erupted. Chuck blinked. He hadn't expected that. He laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh, and pointed at Steven. Okay, that was good. All right, the technique speaks. Let's find out what it says." The mats were set up in the center of the arena, bright white, clean, surrounded on all sides by cameras and by rows of watching martial artists in uniform. The referee moved into position. Staff stepped back to the edges. The crowd settled into an anticipatory hush. Chuck handed the microphone off and rolled his shoulders. Steven set his microphone down slowly and walked to the center of the mat, positioning himself with his feet slightly apart, hands relaxed at his sides, chin level, eyes forward. He looked like a statue that had decided to stand in the middle of a spotlight. Chuck moved toward him with his characteristic bounce, light on his feet, shoulders loose, a small grin still playing at the corners of his mouth. He was in demonstration mode, ready to show off good technique and entertain the crowd, but also genuinely curious now in a way that had replaced the mockery from backstage. He threw a light jab, not a real punch, just a probe, testing the range, seeing what Steven would do. Steven's response was so small that half the arena missed it. His wrist rotated barely 2 inches. Chuck's arm slid past him. That was it. No block, no dodge, just a tiny redirect that felt to Chuck like pushing on a door and finding it had already been gently opened for you, except now you were leaning into empty air. Chuck blinked. He reset. He tried a slightly firmer strike. Steven shifted half a step, touched Chuck's elbow with 2 fingers, and Chuck felt his balance shift sideways by about 3 inches. Not enough to fall, but enough to feel. Enough to know that those 3 inches had been taken from him without his permission. The martial artists watching around the mat began exchanging looks. The understanding of what they were seeing traveled around the ring in whispers. Chuck stepped back. For the first time, his smile was more thoughtful than playful. He said quietly, not to Steven, just to himself. He tried a kick, fast, controlled, accurate. Steven wasn't there when it arrived. He had moved while Chuck was still in the middle of throwing it, a tiny step to the outside that changed the geometry of the whole attack without any effort that the cameras could see. Chuck tried again, then again, jab, cross, a low kick, a feint followed by a real punch. Each time, Steven did almost nothing. A shoulder turn here, a weight shift there, a hand that appeared from nowhere to touch Chuck's forearm and send his momentum in a direction he hadn't chosen. It was like punching smoke that somehow knew exactly where your fist was going before you did. The crowd had gone from cheering to watching, really watching. The noise had dropped to a murmur of focused attention, which in an arena of 15,000 people was its own kind of thunderous silence.
Chuck backed up a few feet and looked at Steven with new eyes. "You're not even using effort," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation with a layer of discomfort underneath it. Steven replied simply, "Effort is what you use when you fight against something. I'm not fighting anything." Chuck absorbed that for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Something shifted in his posture. He stopped bouncing. He lowered his center of gravity slightly. He stopped performing for the crowd and started actually fighting. The quiet, internal version of fighting that real martial artists do before any technique is thrown. He moved in with purpose, a sharp karate-style combination that he had thrown 10,000 times in his life. Jab, cross, low kick, switch step into a second cross. Fast, precise, technically perfect. Steven did something remarkable. He let the first strike come so close that people in the front row grabbed each other's arms. Then, he turned his whole body, just a single rotation, and Chuck's combination turned with him, drawn along by the movement like water following a curve. Chuck found himself moving past Steven's center line, committed to a direction that Steven had chosen for him. He recovered, planted his foot, reset, tried again. The same thing happened. Different technique from Steven, same result. Chuck's force arrived and found nothing there to push against, which is exactly what makes a person lose their balance. When you push hard against something and it isn't there, you fall toward it. One of the senior martial artists watching from the VIP section leaned to the man next to him and said quietly, "Chuck is fighting Steven's style. That's the problem. Steven isn't fighting at all."
Chuck threw a spinning heel kick. It was beautiful, fast, and clean and sharp. The crowd oohed at the sight of it. Steven raised his forearm, deflected the leg at the ankle rather than blocking the shin, and Chuck's rotation carried him past the point of balance. He landed safely, but he had to take an extra step to do it. And that extra step told everyone watching exactly what had happened. Chuck stood still, breathing harder now, not exhausted, just lit up, the way a person gets when they realize the thing in front of them is genuinely extraordinary. "All right," he said. His voice was different, quieter, more real. "I owe you an apology from backstage." The crowd went electric. People looked at each other. Did Chuck Norris just say that out loud? Steven looked at him. "No apologies needed. You showed respect by attacking with intention. That is the honest way." Chuck considered that. "So when I mocked the circles earlier, you were making a reasonable argument," Steven said. "Many people make the same argument. The technique answers the argument better than words can." Chuck exhaled through his nose. Then he smiled. Not the showman smile, something smaller and more real. "Then let it answer," he said, "because I'm not done yet." The crowd heard the tone in his voice and responded accordingly. The noise surged back up, full and electric and huge. What followed was different from what came before. Chuck wasn't testing anymore. He wasn't performing. He was using everything he had, compressed and channeled and targeted. His footwork became sharper. His attacks became faster. He started combining techniques from multiple systems, karate strikes flowing into taekwondo kicks, flowing into wrestling-style grabs, not letting Steven settle into any single rhythm. And it worked, partially. Several times, Chuck got inside the range where Aikido's circular movements needed space to function. He pressed in tight, taking away the room Steven needed to redirect.
He used his body weight and his strength and his speed to try to force straight lines into a style that was built entirely around curves. Steven adapted, but the adjustments were visible now in ways they hadn't been before. He was moving more, working harder. His breathing had changed slightly, becoming more deliberate. The arena felt this and went absolutely wild. Then Chuck made his move. He seized Steven's wrist with both hands, stepped deep into his space, lowered his hips perfectly, and launched a throw that he had drilled 10,000 times. A clean, committed, technically flawless throw that would have put any ordinary person flat on the mat. Steven didn't fall. He didn't resist either. He did something that every martial artist watching would talk about for years afterward. He absorbed Chuck's throw, like a tree absorbs wind, by being rooted so deeply that the force had nowhere to send him. Chuck pulled with everything he had. His face showed the effort. His technique was perfect. Steven stood there. The arena held its breath. Chuck looked up at Steven from his throwing position, still gripping his wrist, and for a single unguarded moment, his expression was pure astonishment. Steven spoke very quietly. Only Chuck could hear it. You cannot redirect a mountain by pulling it. You have to become the mountain. Then Steven moved. It wasn't fast in the way a fast strike is fast. It was fast in the way that a decision is fast, the moment between having made a choice and carrying it out when there is no gap at all. One motion. His arm rotated, flipping Chuck's grip from controlling to controlled. His hip turned, his weight dropped and rose simultaneously in a way that seemed to break the rules of how bodies work. And Chuck Norris, six-time world karate champion, holder of more black belts than most people know exist, a man who had never been easily thrown by anyone in his career, left the ground. The throw was perfect. It was powerful and clean, and so precisely executed that it looked almost gentle from the outside. Chuck traveled through the air in a smooth arc and landed flat on his back on the mat with a sound that went through every single person in that building like a shockwave. Thud. 15,000 people didn't make a single sound for approximately 3 full seconds. That silence was the loudest thing in the arena all night. Then the explosion, people on their feet, screaming, commentators shouting things that made no sense, martial artists in the VIP section grabbing each other by the shoulders, cameras flashing in a continuous white storm across the whole building. Chuck lay on his back, eyes open, chest moving, not hurt, not embarrassed, just completely, utterly still in the way that a person goes still when their entire understanding of something has just been rewritten from scratch in under 1 second. Steven stood over him, offered his hand, said nothing. Chuck stared at the ceiling for one more moment. Then he reached up, gripped Steven's wrist, and let himself be pulled to his feet. He stood there, breathing, looking at Steven Seagal with an expression no camera could fully capture because it was made of too many things at once. Respect, surprise, something close to wonder, and underneath all of it, the particular satisfaction of a genuine martial artist who has just learned something real. He turned to face the crowd. The noise was still enormous. He waited for it to settle just slightly, then raised Steven's arm above his head. I came in here today making jokes about Aikido, he said, and his voice through the microphone carried an honesty that made the crowd go quiet again, wanting to hear every word. I made those jokes backstage. I made them on this stage. I made them in front of thousands of you and in front of this man right here." He glanced at Steven, who stood calmly beside him. "And this man let the technique answer for him every single time." He paused. "Steven Seagal just shut the whole arena up. That throw was as real as anything I have ever felt in 40 years of martial arts, and I've felt a few things." The arena erupted one more time, full and total and genuine. Steven bowed, a single, slow, respectful bow to Chuck, to the crowd, to the art. Chuck shook his head with a slow, genuine smile. "I owe Aikido an apology, too," he said. More laughter from the crowd, but warmer now. "Turns out the circles know exactly what they're doing." Backstage later that evening, the two men sat together quietly. The noise of the arena was muffled now, distant. Crew members moved around them, packing equipment, but gave them space without needing to be asked. Chuck spoke first. "You knew what I was doing out there, the tight pressure, the straight lines, taking away your space." "Yes," Steven said. "And you adjusted." "As the river adjusts to the stone," Steven said simply. Chuck considered that. "So when I mocked the circles earlier, you were making a reasonable argument," Steven said. "Many people make the same argument. The technique answers the argument better than words can." Chuck exhaled through his nose. Then he smiled. Not the showman smile, something smaller and more real. "Then let it answer," he said, "because I'm not done yet." Chuck pointed at him slowly. "That, right there, that's why the whole arena went silent." He leaned back. "It wasn't the throw, Steven. Well, it was the throw, but it was also everything before the throw. The way you stood there and let me talk. The way you let the technique answer every single time I thought I had an argument." He shook his head. "The whole arena went silent because they felt something true." Steven said nothing. He didn't need to. Outside, in the arena, the lights were still going down, and people were slowly making their way toward the exits, but almost no one was looking at their phones. They were talking to each other, telling each other what they had just seen, asking if the other person had caught that moment, that particular moment when Chuck Norris left the ground, when the arena went dead silent, when Steven Seagal proved without a single unnecessary word that the most powerful force in any room is not always the loudest one. It is sometimes the one standing completely still, waiting patiently for the technique to speak.